Good morning. This interview is being conducted for the Veterans History Project in the American Folklife Center at the Library of Congress and the Fairhope Public Library. My name is Mike Perkins, Captain United States Coast Guard, retired. We are at the Public Library in Fairhope, Alabama this morning, February 22nd, 2011, to hear Captain John Rouse tell his story of service to our great country. Captain Rouse retired from the United States Coast Guard. He was born on April 12, 1925 in Martin, Illinois. Captain Rouse served in the U.S. Merchant Marines as a cadet, then deck officer during World War II, and had a distinguished career in the United States Coast Guard spanning 28 years. Captain Rouse, on behalf of a grateful nation, I would like to extend a warm welcome to you this morning and thank you for your willingness to share your story of service to your country. Now, Captain Rouse, you're from the heartland of the country, is that correct?
Well, I guess you could call it that.
And being a young lad, I guess you were growing up as World War II had been going on. What was your life like back then? And tell us a little about your family.
Well, my father was in the Army in World War I, and when he got out of the Army, he got a job with the railroad, and I was born in Mounds, Illinois, which was a terminal of the Illinois Central Railroad. And then came the Big Depression, and of course he didn't have enough seniority to retain the job, so my mother owned a farm in Tennessee, and we moved from Illinois to a little town called Ralston, a little broad place in the road, 50 acres, and he built a house there. He built it himself, and we lived on the farm all through the Depression years, and we managed to exist. He was too proud to go on relief, and so if you live on a farm, you can always eat. And my mother made most of our clothes during that period, and my mother had been a teacher. She was the daughter of a Methodist minister, and she had taught high school English, and she kind of tutored me over the years and made sure that I made good grades, and I was the only child. My mother was 35 when I was born, so I was the only child, and she kind of spoiled me a little bit, I think. But anyway, that's the way I grew up.
Now, John, in the late 1930s and getting up to 1940, just before the war, you were a young teenager. What are your recollections of that period leading up to?
Well, I went to Martin High School in Northwest Tennessee. I played on the football team. I remember the football team. I played in the high school band. At one time, I was president of the student body of the high school, and well, go ahead.
Now, being a young teenager in high school, where were you when you heard that World War II had broken out?
I was a sophomore in high school, and I recall that the principal of the school had a radio up on the stage, and he had the entire student body gathered in the school auditorium, and we all listened to President Roosevelt's Declaration of War.
Wow. And what were your thoughts as you listened to that?
Well, I kind of thought ahead a little bit, and I thought, well, pretty soon I'll probably be in it.
Now, as you're getting ready to graduate, here you are, a young man from Tennessee, and you ended up going to sea in the U.S. Merchant Marines. How did that all happen?
Well, when I was a junior, I started very seriously thinking about what I was going to do, whether I was going to wait to be drafted or whether I had some other avenue. And I happened to run across an article in a magazine that was about the newly established U.S. Merchant Marine Academy. And it gave a little bit about the qualifications required to gain entrance and stuff, and it showed a cadet in his midshipman's uniform, and so that kind of attracted me. I'd never been anywhere much except to Memphis. And so I decided I wanted to see the world, and it'd be nice to be an officer, you know, and I didn't want to get drafted in the Army. And so I decided I'd apply for it, and I was accepted.
Well, still today, that uniform calls a lot of people, doesn't it?
Yeah, it sure does. I thought the girls would probably like it and stuff, you know, like most young men.
Now, when you graduated from high school, then you went right into the Merchant Marine Academy
Yeah,
at Kings Point. Tell me about that.
The program during the war years, it was an 18-month program. You know, they had, well, when I went in, they had actually it was 20 months, because you went to Maritime Service Boot Camp. You know, the Maritime Service was formed to man all these ships that were being built, and trained young Westerners and people that didn't know about the sea to go to sea. So they said that you had to go to boot camp for 2 months, and then you went to cadet basic school for 3 months, and then you went on a merchant ship, actual merchant ship, going to sea for 6 months. Then you went back to the U.S. Merchant Marine Academy in Kings Point, Long Island, for 9 months. So actually it was 20 months, but I went for 1 month, and they decided they wanted to speed up the output of officers for the Merchant Marine, and so they canceled the 2nd month, and I was sent to cadet basic school at Pass Christian, Mississippi. And the basic school was located in an old hotel at Inn by the Sea, and I shared a room with about four other cadets in the bridal suite for 3 months. And then after I completed that, I went to New Orleans and boarded a ship, a Liberty ship. I ended up on a Liberty ship that was bound for Navitas, Cuba. And we went to Navitas, Cuba unescorted, and loaded sugar and went up the East Coast to New York, still unescorted. And of course, in those days, they hadn't started convoys along the East Coast, and the ship had to pull into port every night. So we finally ended up in New York, and when we got to New York, they put guns aboard the ship. They had a 3-inch 50 on the bow, they put a 5-inch 38 on the stern, and they had 420 millimeters. And then they put the gun crew aboard, Navy gun crew. We had a Navy gun crew, a lieutenant junior grade in the Navy, and we had gunner's mates, and we had a couple of signalmen. They sent a couple of signalmen also down. And for battle stations, the merchant crew supplemented the Navy crew at the guns, and we were loaders and ammunition passers and that sort of stuff. My place was as a loader on the 20 millimeter.
John, let me ask you this so that the listeners and viewers will get a good idea of what was going on at the time. What was the why was Kings Point started, and what was the need for U.S. merchant mariners?
Well, they're building all these Liberty ships, and the only way to supply the troops overseas was by the merchant marine, by the merchant ships, and they needed officers to man the ships. And also, since there was naval ROTC at Kings Point, we were also midshipmen in the Naval Reserve as well as being merchant marine cadets, and many graduates went on active duty in the Navy when they graduated, rather than on merchant ships.
Now, these ships were carrying cargo to not only U.S. troops, but we were supplying Britain and Russia. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct.
Now, please give us an idea. Here you are, a young cadet, and you're about to make, I believe, if I remember you telling me, a North Atlantic crossing.
Yes,
What was that all about, and how did they do it?
Well, in addition to getting the guns aboard and the Navy gun crew, we got a deck load of guns, and our first trip was to London, to Great Britain. This was we departed, and I guess we got it was in the winter of 1943, the fall and winter, and we ended up in London the early part of December 1943. We discharged the cargo, and we left London. We went down to the entrance to the English Channel, and there we were standing by waiting for the remainder of the convoy that was to go back to the East Coast to come from other ports around Great Britain. And while we were there, the fog set in, and we were in the fog, and I remember on Christmas Eve, we got a radio message that there were submarines in the vicinity, and we all went up to the abandoned ship stations that night, and we stayed up there for about, I guess we were up there for a couple of hours, and we were finally secured. And the next morning, we looked around, and there was no ships in sight. We were all alone out there. And of course, in those days, the merchant ships didn't have radar, and there was no way to detect whether there's any ships out there or not. So the standing orders were for the convoys, for strays to take the stragglers route. Now the stragglers route, you had to zigzag up to south of Iceland, because and then you turned west, because that portion was pretty well covered by air cover, and submarines kind of avoided areas that were covered by air. So we went up to south of Iceland, and very rough weather. It was cold, and the Liberty ships at maximum speed in good weather conditions made about 10 knots, and one day we made 50 miles, I remember. And we couldn't zigzag, of course. We had to stop zigzagging. And of course, the submarines in that kind of weather couldn't have I don't think couldn't have torpedoed us anyway.
Now, John, you were a deck officer, and you. I remember you telling me about that one day you made 50. That's about a little over 2 miles an hour.
Yeah. We were headed up into it.
On board deck on that Liberty ship, and how big was the Liberty ship?
Oh, it's about 490 feet long, I guess.
And being up on watch in the deck house, what was it like? And give us an idea of the state of the seas and the wind during that 50.
Oh, it was. I would say the wind was probably blowing about 60 knots, something like that, 40 knots, 50 knots. It was a very strong wind and very heavy seas. We were headed into it, and we were pounding pretty heavily. You know, we'd go up on the wave and down into the trough, and so we were taking quite a beating.
Taking water over the bow. I'm sure.
Taking water over the bow, and it wasn't a very comfortable ride, I'll tell you.
Now, normally on these crossings, you mentioned you would be in convoys. Give us an idea of what these convoys were like.
The convoys, you know, station keeping in convoy was not an easy thing to do, because you didn't have radar, and it was sort of a matter of keeping abreast of the ship on your beam and keeping a safe distance astern of the ship ahead of you, and so in order, the way you adjusted speed when you're on watch, you call the engine room and you adjusted you'd call down and say up 2 revolutions and down 2 revolutions. You adjust by, and and it was a difficult thing, and especially in fog. When fog, and you had a lot of fog in the North Atlantic, and there was collisions in fog too.
Now, not only did you have the weather to contend with, you mentioned submarines, and we're talking, of course, about German U-boats. What was the casualties like for the U.S. Merchant Marine?
The casualties for the U.S. Merchant Marine were the highest of any of the services during World War II.
And wow, as a person on board and you're in the North Atlantic, what did you think about the possibility of being torpedoed and going into the water?
Well, it was a constant thing to. You'd hear the depth charges going off from the escorts, from the convoy escorts, and you knew that they had underwater contacts. Some of them were bound to be submarines, and you always slept with your clothes on and with your life jacket next to you in case you had to abandon ship. And it was kind of a trying situation, I guess you might call it.
Now, what was the fate of people whose ship was torpedoed and they went into the water?
Well, they didn't last very long in the North Atlantic because of hypothermia. They probably would last about 3 or 4 minutes, or something like that. And
what were their chances of being picked up by another merchant mariner ship?
Well, they had rescue ships with each convoy. They had a rescue ship. The merchant ships couldn't stop, you know. They couldn't stop to pick people up from a ship that had been torpedoed. But the rescue ships, but the chances weren't too good.
Wow. Now, on one particular convoy, I believe you told me that you actually went to Russia. Would you tell me about that, please?
Yeah, that was after I graduated from Kings Point. I graduated in December 22nd, 1944. Now, during the war years, they used to graduate a class every 2 weeks, you know. And so the first ship that I got was another Liberty ship. I was as third mate, and it so happened that the ship, I saw the cold weather gear coming aboard after I reported aboard, and I decided I might have made a mistake, but it was too late. and so we the Murmansk convoys, they took a regular convoy to Great Britain, and we the Murmansk convoys were formed in Gurrock, Scotland, and we had the Royal Navy escorts from Gurrock to Murmansk, and so by that time, as the latter, it was getting near the end of the war in Europe, and we had as many escorts as we did merchant ships, and we really didn't have any trouble, too much trouble, except with the weather and the cold and stuff. You know, Murmansk is above the Arctic Circle, and we were in the Barents Sea. The Barents Sea is part of the Arctic Ocean, and in order to get into Murmansk, the ships had to get into single file. The convoy would break up and get into single file because the docks in Murmansk were up the Kola River, and we had several miles to go up the Kola River, and we had to go single file up the river. And so there's all kinds of confusion. We're inside of land, and I was on watch. I was on the 8 to 12 watch. The captain was on the bridge also, and we saw a signal come up from another Liberty ship about 1,000 yards away, and it was a signal that they'd been torpedoed. And so we kept on, you know. The escorts were dropping depth charges all over the place, and the Russian plane came out, and it was dropping bombs, and all hell broke loose. But we kept on, and we went up the river and managed to get to the dock, and we found out later that they'd managed to run the Liberty ship aground. The torpedo had hit the engine room, and the only casualties were in the engine room, and so it could have been worse. But the thing about the Russian convoys was that the escorts that brought the incoming convoy brought the last convoy back. So you spent a whole month you spent a whole month in Murmansk, waiting for your escort to go home.
What did you deliver for cargo? Do you recall?
Yeah, well, we had military cargo. We had military cargo. The Russians were not very friendly. Murmansk was just complete rubble, practically. The only place to go was the Seamen's Club. The people were afraid to have anything to do with us, you know, and so it wasn't a pleasant stay, to say the least.
Yeah. As a result,
it was cold and ice and snow, and
as a result of you serving, in the Russian war theater in World War II. You told me that you got a medal from the Russian government, which is kind of unusual. What was that all about?
Well, Boris Yeltsin decided on the 40th anniversary of the end after VE Day, he decided that all of the seamen that had made the trip to North Russia, and North Russia would never have won the war without the 40 convoys that went to North Russia, because they didn't have the material, they didn't have anything that would help them to. They didn't have anything of their own that they could use. He decided it'd be a nice gesture if he awarded all the seamen that made the trip these medals, and that's the way I got my medal. Incidentally, on our return trip, we had been out of Murmansk about 4 days, and we got a message from the Commodore of the convoy that the war in Europe was over and we could proceed independently. So we proceeded independently, thank goodness, back to Gurk, Scotland, to await further orders. And
Now,
I had the first watch, and being the low man on the totem pole, so to speak, as third mate, the rest of the officers on the ship went up to Glasgow to celebrate, and I had the watch, and we were anchored out in Gurk Harbor, and there's some loaded tankers out there also, and people were shooting rockets up in the air from the ships, and finally the harbor master had to send somebody around to tell them to stop it before they blew up. But the next day I was relieved, and I went up and celebrated the day after.